Okay, muchachos. Today I'd like to talk about book 2 in Plato. Now you read that for today, allegedly, and you're reading book 3, or what is it, the assignment?
3 by Friday.
Yeah, 3 by Friday. Okay, so we're good. Well, I'd like to start today by talking just a little bit about myth in general. Let me turn on the lights because I feel like I'm okay, you vampires. I am a vampire. Well, now you are toast. You go up in a big ball of flame. Right. I want to talk first off about mythology in general, and the idea of mythology in general. Just to go back to something that I brought up from the beginning of the year. I was reading this article the other day in American Arts Quarterly, and it's on an exhibition on Aphrodite, and Aphrodite in art. And this is Gail Leggio, and she makes 3, I think, very interesting claims about mythology that are pertinent to book 2. First, she says, Sigmund Freud constructed the edifice of psychoanalysis in part on the power of Eros. Myths survive because they give succeeding generations ways to think about the complex patterns of life. I like that. That's good. I can put that on the board. I like it. Good phrase. Myths, she says, survive because they give succeeding generations ways to think about the complex patterns of life. So in other words, mythology, Leggio is pointing out here, is a language. It's a language that allows us to understand certain things that otherwise are rather difficult to understand. Right. In the same article, she goes on to say the following. She's quoting Frederick Schelling, a art critic and philosopher. And it says, Frederick Schelling summed up the case for archetypes in mythology, writing that the gods are the absolute itself seen through the particular and considered as real, and that mythology is the necessary condition and material of all art, the forms through which eternal ideas may be expressed. And one last insight, which I think is somewhat pertinent rather than impertinent. Jean-Pierre Vernant, the classicist, writes, myth is only alive when it goes on being recounted. The myth story is both polysemous, like a poetic text, in its multiple layers of meaning, and unlike a poem, not fixed in definite form. The story remains somewhat open to innovation. So it's only alive when it goes on being recounted. All 3 of these insights, I think, are important to note when thinking about what Plato's doing, because Plato taps into these 3 ideas. On the one hand, myths survive because they're a language. They give us a language for understanding things that are rather complex. Second, mythology itself is the grounding for artwork. It's not necessarily the grounding for philosophy, but it's the grounding for artwork, definitely. And third, it is alive when it's being recounted. We can chop it up and take bits and pieces to understand them individually, but the myth is alive while we're watching it or reading it or hearing it. When we chop it up into bits, it's no longer alive any more than, say, a bird is alive when we chop it into bits to examine the parts. When you cut the fetal pig or whatever that you guys have to dissect, or the shark. What do you guys dissect anyway? You dissect something? Frog. Yeah. When you dissect the crayfish or the frog, it's not alive when you're dissecting it. That'd be a very bad dissection. Very difficult to do. Stay still! So it's the similar thing is when you just dissect a myth, you do so to understand it, and you understand parts of it, but it's only living in the telling of the myth. Now, Plato does something particularly interesting with his own mythology. This is taken from a book called Collected Myths by Plato. It's just a collection of myths taken out of his dialogue. Why, she asks, did Plato season his philosophic discourse, which he sometimes referred to as logos, with these fantastical stories? Why did he not avoid, as the vast majority of philosophers have done, the infiltration of mythos into logos? First, there's a practical reason. Myth is, Plato thought, an efficient means of persuasion. A myth is supposed to make one adopt a particular belief, and its persuasive powers are not to be underestimated, right? In other words, myth persuades people far more than philosophy does. You tell them a good story, and they're like, oh, that sounds true, I believe that. Whereas if you go all this philosophical mumbo-jumbo, they'll just argue. Now, she goes on to say that, at the bottom of that paragraph, a myth, however, may be useful even to a sharp-minded philosopher. For myths, at least those promoted by Plato, are supposed to make those who believe in them behave well. There is, however, another reason for Plato's telling so many myths, a philosophical reason. Plato believed that humans are not able to reach the ultimate truth about reality. As he claims in Timaeus, human intelligence can never be omniscient. As its model, the intelligence of the universe is. A human being, he goes on in Timaeus, is provided with the right nurture, education, and philosophy, can escape the worst of maladies, ignorance, and attain as much as human nature permits, the truth about himself and his world. But our human nature, let us suggest, by telling us so many myths, often permits us only to approximate the truth, and only indirectly through a fictional narrative. This means that sometimes for Plato, myth is the only device available to enable us to explore matters that are beyond our limited intellectual powers. The only device available to us to explore certain matters. Now that's a sort of a segue to look at this myth of Gyges Ring that occurs in Book 2, because this is the first of three major myths that occur during the course of the dialogue. If we wanted to frame the dialogue, we would take these three myths, I'm going to say the beginning, the middle, and the end of the dialogue. The beginning myth that defines the Republic is this Gyges Ring. Gyges' ring starts us off, gives a framework, the difficulty, the problem. It sets us up for what we're going to face in the course of the dialogue. The second one is the myth of the cave. A myth that even now is referred to frequently in our society. We see it in movies like Matrix, for instance. I saw somebody just sent me a French movie that was based on this idea of getting out of the cave. There's also the movie The Cave, I guess, like that. The third myth is the myth of which ends the dialogue. And so we start here, we begin to progress out here, and we move to a solution here. Problem, beginning of solution, and solution. And if you're very circumspect, you'll notice that this very shape is the shape that geometrically I've been showing you over and over and over again. Plato is doing the same thing in the course of this dialogue that he has done in Euthyphro that he suggested elsewhere. This is, I can write it smaller, but still the golden rectangle idea, the interlocking circles, and therefore it is the golden proportion, right? The divided line, the indefinite dyad. Well, this myth of Gyges' ring, which starts us off and begins the whole problem, is not told by Socrates, though. It's told by somebody else, by Glaucon. And consequently, the context is something that we need to think about as well. Why did he tell this myth? Why did he tell this story? What's the problem, or what's at issue? In order to see that, we wanted to open up with Book 2 in the Republic. And what's at stake in Book 2 in the Republic? Remember at the end of Book 1, Socrates has thoroughly, handsomely defeated Thrasymachus. What did Thrasymachus propose was the definition of justice? Greg? The man with the most power gets to say. And so the tyrant, the man who tries to benefit himself and fleece all the people, that's the guy who's the most just, because he can define it as whatever he wants. Like, Kim Jong-il, I can define justice as I see fit because I am the glorious leader, the dear leader. Well, Socrates embarrasses him, defeats him publicly, basically shows him to be a clod in front of everybody, and so he wins handily. And by the end of it, you think, well, that's the end of it. But as he points out, that was merely a prelude. If you open up to the opening of Book 2, it says in the opening of Book 2, now, when I had said this, I thought I was freed from argument. But after all, as it seems, it was only a prelude. That whole first book was just a prelude, like a narthex into a church. This is the vestibule, the doorstep into the cathedral of the rest of the dialogue. And everything in that prelude was like a hint at what was going to come later. For Glaucon is always most courageous in everything, and so now he didn't accept Thrasymachus giving up. By the way, anybody know who Glaucon is? Anybody look up that chap or find out that chap's origin? That is the brother of Plato. Plato's brother, who jumps in here. And so this is a sort of an oblique reference to the author himself. My brother was the one who started off the battle. And Glaucon says, Socrates, do you want to seem to have persuaded us, so truly to persuade us, that it is in every way better to be just than unjust? Well, I would choose to persuade you truly. Well, then, you're not doing what you want. Tell me, is there in your opinion a kind of good that we would choose to have, not because we desire its consequences, but because we delight in it for its own sake? And what about this? Is there a kind we like both for its own sake and for what comes out of it? And do you see a third form of good which includes gymnastic and exercise and medical treatment when sick, as well as the practice of medicine and the rest of activities that money makes? We would say that they're drudgery, but they're beneficial. And we would not choose to have them for themselves, but for the sake of the wages and whatever else comes out of them. Well, which one do you call justice? Socrates says, well, I suppose it belongs to the finest kind. Well, that's not what most people think, says Glaucon. Rather, it seems to belong to the form of drudgery which should be practiced for the sake of wages and the reputation that comes from opinion. But all by itself, it should be fled from as something hard. Glaucon says basically the majority of people think of justice, and therefore goodness, as like a big horse pill. It's like a giant cosmic suppository. Okay? It's like something nasty that you have to do in order to become cured. But it's not something you willingly would do. Glaucon suggests that basically when we're talking about justice, and by justice, by the way, we read goodness, he thinks that justice, essentially, is something which is distasteful, unpleasant, onerous, but is done because of what it offers. Namely, fame, peace of mind, good life eventually. But most people, Glaucon says, do not view justice as good in of itself. They think of justice as somehow getting them a goods somewhere or another. But if they had a chance, Glaucon, they would not do goodness. They would not be good. They would not do justice at all. And in order to illustrate his point, he tells a myth. Given the opportunity, most people would not do justice. They would not do the just thing. And that's where he tells this myth of Gyges' ring. The whole myth exists in order to prove the idea that people don't do goodness naturally. That basically at heart, human beings are rotten. They're lousy. They're evil. And that goodness is only something we do because we think we're going to get something good out of it. Pie in the sky, by and by, right? Heaven eventually. Reputation right now. Maybe if you pray really hard, God will send you a fortune, like in the prayer of Jezebel or whatever it is. Job is. What the hell? Before I go into the myth, I pose the question. Are people at heart good, decent, or are people at heart rotten? Given the opportunity, would all of us do good? Or given the opportunity to never get caught, nobody would ever know, would we engage in evil? Here's the myth. He suggests that most people would do injustice if they got the chance. And he makes the myth on page 37 of Gyges Ring to prove this point. This is line 359d. The license of which I speak, that is, the license to do evil if given the chance, would best be realized if they should come into possession of the sort of power that it is said the ancestor of Gyges the Lydian once got. They say he was a shepherd, toiling in the service of the man who was then ruling Lydia. There came to pass a great thunderstorm and an earthquake. The earth cracked and a chasm opened at the place where he was pastured. He saw it, wondered at it, and went down. He saw, along with other quite wonderful things about which they tell tales, a hollow bronze horse. It had windows. Peeping in, he saw there was a corpse inside that looked larger than human size. It had nothing on except a gold ring on its hand. He slipped it off and went out. When there was the usual gathering of the shepherds to make the monthly report to the king about the flocks, he too came, wearing the ring. Now while he was sitting with the others, he chanced to turn the collar of the ring to himself, toward the inside of his hand. When he did this, he became invisible to those sitting by him. They discussed him as though he were away. He wondered at this. Fingering the ring again, he twisted the collet toward the outside. And when he twisted it, he became visible. Thinking this over, he tested whether the ring had this power. That's exactly his result. When he turned the collet inward, he became invisible. When outward, visible. Aware of this, he immediately contrived to be one of the messengers to the king. When he arrived, he committed adultery with the king's wife, and along with her set upon the king and killed him, and so he took over the rule. Now if there were two such rings, and the just man would put one on and the unjust man the other, no one, as it would seem, would be so adamant as to stick by justice and bring himself to keep away from what belongs to others and not lay hold of it, although he had license to take what he wanted from the market without fear, to go into houses, and have intercourse with whomever he wanted, to slay or release from bonds whomever he wanted, and to do other things as unequal to a god among humans. And in so doing, one would act no differently from the other, but both would go the same way. So Glaucon's whole point here is, look, when it comes down to it, when the chips are down, there are no good humans. Everybody is evil. Goodness, honesty, mercy, nobility, they're all illusions. They're lies, they don't exist. The reality of it, no matter how harsh this may seem, the reality is that at heart, every human being is evil, and given the opportunity, would do evil. That's a very stunning critique, I think. See, I think most of us have a tendency to think of ourselves as pure as the driven snow. We're the best thing on the face of the planet. If we were in a crisis situation, we would do great. We would save those kittens from the burning fire, right? We would not tell a lie. We would uphold truth, justice in the American way. Yet if the reality were to be told, as Glaucon puts it, most of us, when the chips are down, or when the chips aren't down, tend to do things that are bad. You're on the internet and you go somewhere where you shouldn't go and you see something you shouldn't see. Click. No one ever finds out. End of story. You have a chance to cheat or lie on a test. No one's going to find out. Gets you a good grade. Gets you into Harvard. You have a chance to steal something. Download from Napster or whatever it is. No one's going to find out. Go do it. And if you were never to get caught, if you were to be so good and so sly that no one catches you, you're good at lying, good at looking good, good at deceiving everybody, you'd now have no problems, right? Glaucon says that's the state of everybody. People only do good, Glaucon suggests, because they're scared. Or else because they think somehow they're going to get a trophy when they kick the bucket. And I think his critique makes us, or should make us, reflect on our own situation. Is it true that we are as pure as the driven snow? Is it true that we are God's gift to humanity? Is it true that in every situation we would do good and avoid evil? Because if Glaucon's right, the answer is no. The answer is we would do evil if we thought we would not get caught.